Military academies taught it as gospel. Take the high ground. Captain Marcus Tremaine ignored that lesson on a frozen November night in 1867 and led his cavalry company into a shallow valley while 3 other units made camp on the ridgeline above. His fellow officers called it cowardice disguised as caution. The morning revealed something different. Tremaine's horses stood alert and watered. His men rested behind natural windbreaks, while the ridge camps had lost 11 horses to exposure and exhaustion from hauling water up impossible slopes through the night. What the textbooks forgot to mention was that cavalry did not fight like infantry, and the ground that won battles could destroy an army before the battle ever came. Chapter 1. The Doctrine Nobody Questioned. The principle seemed so obvious that questioning it felt like questioning gravity itself. High ground offered superior observation, defensive advantage, and psychological dominance over any force approaching from below. Military strategists from ancient Rome through the Napoleonic Wars had built entire campaigns around seizing and holding elevated positions. West Point instructors drilled this concept into every officer who passed through their classrooms, and the men who rode out to the American frontier carried that doctrine with them, like scripture written in their bones. Captain Marcus Tremaine had memorized those lessons as thoroughly as any graduate of the academy. He understood the tactical mathematics that made hilltops valuable in combat. Arrows and bullets traveled farther downhill, charging upward exhausted attackers before they reached defensive lines. Elevated positions allowed commanders to read the battlefield and anticipate enemy movements. These principles had proven themselves across centuries and continents, validated by victories that shaped the boundaries of empires. The instructors at West Point spoke of terrain the way preachers spoke of providence. They referenced Hannibal crossing the Alps and the defensive positions that had broken cavalry charges throughout European warfare. They analyzed Wellington's use of reverse slopes and the ridgelines that had decided battles from Thermopylae to Gettysburg. What those instructors rarely discussed with equal emphasis was the fundamental difference between choosing ground for battle and choosing ground for camp. A cavalry unit might occupy a hilltop for 6 hours of fighting and emerge victorious. That same unit might occupy the same hilltop for 12 hours of rest and emerge crippled, not from enemy action, but from the simple physics of keeping horses alive in hostile terrain. The distinction mattered enormously, yet doctrine treated it as an afterthought when addressed the question at all. The autumn of 1867 found Tremaine commanding a company of the 3rd Cavalry in the Nebraska Territory, operating as part of a larger column pursuing bands that had been raiding settlements along the Platte River. 4 companies rode together under the overall command of Major William Ashford, a decorated veteran who had distinguished himself in the war between the states and transferred west seeking continued action. Ashford believed in textbook warfare with the fervor of a man who had seen those textbooks validated in blood. He had watched infantry hold elevated positions against Confederate charges, and he carried those memories into a landscape that operated by different rules entirely. When the column halted on the afternoon of November 14th, Ashford surveyed the landscape with the practiced eye of an experienced commander. A long ridge ran roughly north to south, offering commanding views of the prairie in 3 directions. The 4th direction dropped away into a shallow valley where a creek wound through cottonwood groves before disappearing into rougher country to the west. Ashford saw the ridge as an obvious choice. Any approaching force would have to climb toward the cavalry position, visible for miles before they could pose any real threat. The tactical advantages seemed self-evident to a man trained to think in terms of fields of fire and defensive perimeters. Tremaine saw something different. He saw the distance between that ridge and the water source below. He saw the exposed nature of the high ground, swept by winds that had been building strength all afternoon. He saw the complete absence of natural shelter, the lack of grazing within reasonable distance, and the exhaustion already showing in horses that had covered 18 miles since dawn. Most importantly, he saw the gap between what made sense for infantry and what made sense for mounted troops whose effectiveness depended entirely on the condition of their animals. The disagreement that followed would have been unremarkable under normal circumstances. Junior officers questioned senior officers regularly, and senior officers overruled those questions with equal regularity. Ashford listened to Tremaine's concerns about water access and wind exposure with the patience of a man who had heard similar objections before and found them wanting. He pointed out that the ridge offered superior defensive positioning, that water details could haul sufficient supplies from the creek below, and that cavalry horses had endured far worse conditions throughout the recent war. Tremaine pressed his case with calculations that Ashford dismissed as excessive caution. A cavalry horse required between 8 and 15 gallons of water daily under normal conditions. Hard riding in cold weather could push that requirement even higher as animals burned energy to maintain body temperature. Multiply those numbers by the roughly 200 horses in the column, and the water requirement approached 3,000 gallons per night. Hauling that volume up a 200-foot elevation gain would exhaust men and whatever pack animals they pressed into service, leaving the entire command degraded before any enemy appeared. The numbers meant nothing to Ashford. He had commanded men through conditions that would break lesser officers, and he trusted his judgment over arithmetic presented by a captain with limited combat experience. He reminded Tremaine that armies had always faced logistical challenges and that determined soldiers overcame them through effort and discipline rather than through surrendering advantageous terrain to theoretical concerns about convenience. Ashford made his decision with the confidence of rank. 3 companies would make camp on the ridge as planned. Tremaine could take his company into the valley if he preferred comfort over tactical soundness, but he would do so with the understanding that his judgment had been noted and found deficient. The other officers present said nothing, unwilling to challenge their commanding officer over a matter that seemed minor compared to the larger mission they had been assigned. Chapter 2. When the ridge became a trap. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the first 3 hours after sunset. Wind that had seemed manageable during daylight transformed into a constant assault that found every gap in clothing and every weakness in hastily erected shelters. The ridge that had offered such commanding views now offered those same views to a wind that swept across the exposed ground without obstruction, carrying away heat faster than fires could replace it. Men who had dismissed Tremaine's concerns began reconsidering their positions as the cold intensified with each passing hour. The 3 companies on the ridge discovered immediately that their elevated position created problems the textbooks had never mentioned. Fires refused to burn properly in the relentless wind, flames whipping sideways and showering sparks across men who had no escape from the chaos. Soldiers tried building windbreaks from saddles and equipment, but the gusts found ways around every barrier they constructed. Tents that would have provided adequate shelter in a protected location became useless fabric flapping against poles that threatened to tear loose with every gust. The canvas snapped and cracked through the darkness like rifle shots, adding noise to the misery that already surrounded the encampment. Horses picketed along the ridge line turned their hindquarters to the wind and stood with heads lowered, burning precious energy just to maintain body temperature. Their breath came out in clouds that the wind shredded instantly, carrying moisture away from animals that desperately needed to conserve every resource their bodies possessed. Troopers walked the picket lines and saw the distress building in animals they depended upon for their own survival in hostile territory. The water situation proved even worse than Tremaine had predicted. Details sent down to the creek returned with containers that held far less than expected, water sloshing out during the difficult climb back up slopes that had seemed moderate in daylight but became treacherous in darkness. Men slipped on frost-covered grass and spilled their loads. Some fell hard enough to injure themselves, adding to the burden on a command already struggling with conditions it had created through poor site selection. Pack mules balked at the repeated trips, their own exhaustion compounding with each journey. The animals had covered the same 18 miles as the horses, and they possessed no greater reserves to draw upon for the endless hauling that the ridge position demanded. By midnight, the horses on the ridge had received perhaps a quarter of the water they needed, and the men tasked with hauling it were too exhausted to continue. Officers faced an impossible choice between pushing their soldiers to the point of collapse or accepting that the animals would suffer through the night without adequate hydration. Neither option offered anything resembling a satisfactory outcome. Sergeant Thomas Kehoe later described that night as the longest of his military service. He had fought at Gettysburg and survived the Wilderness Campaign, but nothing in those experiences had prepared him for watching cavalry horses deteriorate hour by hour from simple exposure and thirst. The animals stood with dull eyes and rough coats, their usual alertness replaced by the lethargy that signaled dangerous dehydration. Some refused to eat the grain that troopers offered, their bodies too stressed to process food without adequate water to support digestion. Kehoe had seen horses shot from under their riders in combat, but watching them suffer slowly from preventable causes struck him as somehow worse. The cavalry field manual that every officer carried specified clear warnings about horse care. The efficiency of mounted units depended almost entirely upon the condition of their horses, which alone enabled them to cover long distances quickly when emergencies demanded speed. Horses had to be nursed with great care so they could endure extreme fatigue when circumstances required it. The manual warned against excessive galloping because it broke down horses quickly, and it emphasized that commanding officers bore direct responsibility for maintaining their animals in conditions suitable for hard service. Those words read very differently at 2 in the morning on a frozen ridge where the wind never stopped and the water never arrived in sufficient quantity. 3 horses died before dawn. 8 more showed signs of severe distress that would require days of rest and careful management before they could carry riders again. The men themselves fared only marginally better, exhausted from fighting the wind, demoralized by their inability to care for animals that represented their primary military capability. When the sun finally rose on a clear and bitterly cold morning, Major Ashford surveyed his command and found it substantially diminished without any enemy having fired a single shot. The ridge that had promised tactical advantage had delivered only suffering and loss. Chapter 3. The Logic of Low Ground. 200 feet below the ridge, Captain Tremaine's company had experienced a fundamentally different night. The valley that Ashford had dismissed as tactically inferior had provided exactly the protection that cavalry horses required to maintain their condition through harsh weather. Cottonwood groves blocked the worst of the wind, their bare branches still sufficient to disrupt the gusts that had tormented the ridge throughout the darkness. The creek offered unlimited water within steps of the picket lines, flowing steadily despite the cold and accessible without any of the exhausting labor that had broken the ridge companies. Natural grazing supplemented the grain that troopers carried, reducing the burden on limited supplies and giving the horses something to occupy their attention through the long night. The animals moved along the creek bank, drinking when they chose and finding patches of dry grass that provided both nutrition and the psychological comfort of normal equine behavior. They did not stand huddled and miserable against impossible wind. They behaved like horses that expected to work hard the following day and knew how to prepare themselves for that effort. Tremaine had positioned his camp with deliberate attention to the factors that kept mounted units effective. He selected a bend in the creek where high banks on the north side created a natural windbreak. The terrain feature cost nothing to construct and required no maintenance through the night, yet provided protection that no amount of human effort could have replicated on the exposed ridge above. He spread his horses across ground where they could reach water without requiring human intervention, allowing the animals to drink according to their own needs rather than waiting for exhausted details to haul insufficient quantities from distant sources. He established his picket lines among the trees where branches disrupted airflow and created pockets of relative warmth. The temperature in those protected spaces ran several degrees higher than on the open ridge, a difference that mattered enormously to animals and men trying to rest through a November night on the Nebraska plains. Tremaine posted guards at the valley entrance and along the creek, maintaining security without sacrificing the advantages his position offered. The science behind his decisions reflected principles that frontier experience had been teaching cavalry officers for years, even as formal doctrine continued emphasizing infantry-derived concepts of terrain superiority. Cold air settled into valleys at night, but so did protection from wind that represented the far greater threat to both men and animals. Elevated positions offered observation advantages, but cavalry units operating in hostile territory maintained observation through mounted patrols rather than fixed positions. The mobility that defined cavalry effectiveness required healthy horses, and healthy horses required water, shelter, and rest that ridgelines rarely provided. Roman legions had understood this distinction 2,000 years earlier. Their military engineers selected campsites with careful attention to water access, specifying that camps needed proximity to rivers or springs and positioning the camp entrance toward the water source so that men and animals could resupply with minimum effort. Elevated terrain was desirable for defensive purposes, but the site itself needed to balance defensive considerations against the practical requirements of sustaining the force through the night. A camp that degraded the army's capability served no tactical purpose regardless of how impressive it appeared on the map. The Romans conquered an empire by understanding that armies had to survive between battles, not merely during them. Tremaine's horses greeted the dawn alert and properly hydrated, their coats smooth and their eyes bright with the energy that indicated animals ready for hard service. His men had slept in shifts through a cold but manageable night, their fires burning steadily in the protected space between the creek bank and the tree line. When orders came to resume the march, his company mounted and formed with the crisp efficiency that characterized well-maintained cavalry, while the ridge companies struggled to organize men and animals still recovering from their ordeal. The contrast between the two camps illustrated a principle that formal military education had consistently undervalued. Terrain that favored defensive combat did not automatically favor the activities that preceded and followed combat. An army spent far more time making camp, maintaining equipment, and caring for animals than it spent actually fighting. Doctrine that optimized for the hours of battle, while ignoring the days of preparation, produced forces that arrived at battle already compromised. Tremaine understood this truth intuitively, while his superiors had to learn it through costly experience. Chapter 4. What the Losses Taught. Major Ashford possessed enough integrity to recognize what the night had demonstrated. His after-action report acknowledged that the ridge position had created unnecessary hardship and recommended that future operations give greater weight to water access and weather protection when selecting campsites. He stopped short of admitting that Tremaine had been correct, but the substance of his recommendations validated everything the captain had argued. The report circulated through command channels and added to a growing body of evidence that frontier cavalry operations required different thinking than the Eastern campaigns that had shaped current doctrine. The lessons from that November night eventually found their way into revised cavalry doctrine, though the process took years and required additional costly examples before the institution fully accepted what field experience kept proving. The 1874 edition of Cavalry Tactics included expanded guidance on campaign camping, emphasizing that commanding officers had to bear in mind that efficiency depended almost entirely upon horse condition. The manual specified that camps should be established where water and grazing were readily accessible, acknowledging that defensive terrain considerations had to be balanced against the practical requirements of maintaining mounted capability. The manual warned against encamping without water merely to secure grazing, noting that all animals had to be watered within an hour of the last halt if the night position lacked adequate sources. It specified that the average march for cavalry should range from 15 to 20 miles per day, with a walk as the habitual gait, and it cautioned against the excessive use of galloping that broke down horses quickly. These guidelines reflected hard-won knowledge purchased through nights like the one Ashford's command endured on that frozen Nebraska ridge. Subsequent campaigns on the frontier reinforced these principles repeatedly. Units that prioritized water access and wind protection consistently outperformed those that applied infantry doctrine without modification. The difference showed not in dramatic single incidents, but in the cumulative effect of horses that arrived at engagement strong versus horses that arrived exhausted, of men who had rested adequately versus men who had spent their nights fighting conditions their camp selection had created. Commanders who learned from mistakes like Ashford's built reputations for effectiveness, while those who clung to textbook orthodoxy found their commands degrading through preventable losses. The broader lesson extended beyond the specific question of ridges versus valleys. Military doctrine derived from historical experience, but that experience had to be interpreted correctly for the specific circumstances at hand. Infantry could climb hills and descend to water sources using their own legs. Cavalry horses could not be reasoned with or motivated by patriotism. They required specific physical inputs in specific quantities, and no amount of tactical elegance could substitute for meeting those requirements. An officer who ignored those requirements might win the argument over camp placement, but he would lose something far more valuable in the process. Captain Tremaine continued his cavalry service for another decade, eventually reaching the rank of major before retiring to a ranch in Colorado. He never wrote a manual or delivered lectures at military academies, but the officers who served under him carried forward an understanding of mounted operations that prioritized the health of horses as the foundation of everything else cavalry could accomplish. Some lessons could only be learned by watching others make mistakes and having the judgment to choose differently. Tremaine had possessed that judgment on a night when it mattered, and the men who rode with him remembered. The ridge where 3 companies suffered through that November night eventually became just another piece of unremarkable Nebraska terrain. No monument marked the location where 11 horses died, and a command learned the difference between winning battles and surviving campaigns. But the principle that emerged from that frozen ground shaped cavalry operations for a generation, reminding every officer who paid attention that the ground which offered the best view was not always the ground that kept an army fit to fight. Sometimes the low ground was not a retreat from tactical wisdom. Sometimes it was the only choice that tactical wisdom actually supported. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale.